And one of the really good tools that we have to then put the municipalities and the public sector and the companies together is market dialogues. I think this is a very underused tool that we have that is actually related to public procurement, but it doesn't even have to be, that we can use to bring the public sector and the private companies together. And we hear this over and over again from companies that they would like to have a lot more conversation and a lot more co-creation and a lot more interaction with municipalities.
And today's guest here with me, so we're ready to roll. Welcome to the Circular Coffee Break podcast, where we will be talking about everything circular and beyond. My guest today is Karoliina Tuukkanen, Senior Specialist at Kipi, or Kiertotalous Pirkanmaa, and for those of you non-Finnish speaking, that is Circular Economy Pirkanmaa. So the Pirkanmaa region is the region around Tampere. Karoliina has a long history in working in the city of Tampere and the Pirkanmaa region to establish an ecosystem that accelerates the transition towards circularity. And I'm really looking forward to talk with her about her work at Kipi and the role of cities, municipalities, and regions in developing a sustainably circular economy. Welcome to the show, Karoliina.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Really great to have you here. We know each other for some time already and had a chance to work together. But for our listeners, could you maybe start by introducing yourself and tell us a little bit about the background and the work of Kiertotalous Pirkanmaa or Kipi?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the invite. I was so glad to be able to speak to you on the podcast. So a little bit about my background, because I think it's always interesting for people to sort of hear who's speaking and from what perspective. So I come from the social sciences, although I think I speak semi-fluent engineer as well. But my background is not in engineering, rather in the political sciences and all of that. So I actually studied environmental policy in the University of Tampere. And I worked in NGOs quite a lot in the development cooperation side. And then I switched to the municipal side and went actually and worked for the city of Tampere in developing circular economy. And that was sort of the big sort of breakthrough in my mind when I got to the municipal sector, in understanding what the role of cities is in breaking through in these sort of sustainable development related issues. And that's where my journey started and is now sort of in the regional aspect more. And we had quite a lot of luck when we were first cooperating with you, Michael. We were still developing the operational model for Circular Pirkanmaa, Kiertotalous Pirkanmaa, or as we call it, Kipi. And we were sort of still in that stage where we didn't even know whether we would be able to establish ourselves and be able to sort of start implementing what we were thinking about doing. But we had this idea that circular economy needs operators and needs sort of orchestrators to be able to really deep dive into the systemic change related issues. And we realized that there is this lack of orchestrators, especially when it comes to the regional and municipal side and on the public side. And then we were sort of involved in the strategies of the national level in circular economy, and we were in those kind of expert groups with other municipalities and regions and cities, and we started talking about what we should do in circular economy if we really wanted to reach that systemic change that we keep talking about, but we don't really see in Finland yet. And that's where the idea of this kind of regional perspective to circular economy came from. And then we started sort of talking about it more here in the region of Tampere and Pirkanmaa, and started thinking about whether we could start developing this kind of operational model for the regional circular economy development. And that's what we did. And we were then doing it under Verte, which is this kind of municipal development company who is responsible for the Eco3 circular economy area. And they were the ones that applied for this kind of funding to develop this operational model for the Regional Development Center. And I was the one, together with my colleague from the city of Tampere, who came in to actually think about what this development center could do, what the offering would be, what the services would be. And we were lucky enough that we actually found sort of a home base for ourselves immediately after that project. And we started operating in 2023. So now we're basically operating with this regional development center for circular economy. And I think we are one of the few actors in Finland who are solely sort of focusing on circular economy. So there aren't that many in Finland who are doing this only in the circular economy realm. And especially because we focus on municipalities and then also on companies. And we're thinking a lot about how municipalities could do things differently so that companies could actually build business cases out of circular economy. And we're focusing especially on the built environment and on the industrial sort of material flows. So that's the background of what happened and why regional development and why circular economy and where we come from.
Great. Thanks a lot, Karoliina. And I think what you're saying is really an important topic, because circular economy requires a lot of different players, and cities, municipalities, regions very often have a very important role in enabling circularity, basically providing a platform where companies, citizens, and other players can actually come together to create circularity in that context. And you said you're one of the examples or spearhead organizations in Finland. I think it's actually globally that you have very seldom within cities this focus on circularity as a core activity in that context.
Yeah, that's actually very true. And we are part of the CCRI program, which is Circular Cities and Regions, which is this sort of European Commission program for circular economy, especially in the regional concept or in the context. And we've noticed even there that we are one of the only benchmarks for this kind of activity. And it sort of they ask me to speak about it quite a lot now, because I think we're sort of now realizing the role of municipalities and now realizing that the municipalities actually need to do something to change the operational environment. And I think municipalities in Finland don't really see their own role yet. So they need entities like us to sort of wake them up a little bit and remind them of their own role, because it is something added. So I understand that it's not the first thing that you want to do is add more responsibilities into your palette. But I think municipalities actually have a key role in many aspects of creating that operational environment and also markets for circular economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And very often I think it's about showing success stories and showing what has happened. So do you have maybe a couple of like the most innovative circular economy initiatives or in more general success stories that you had at Kipi that you have been implementing or that you've been supporting that you could share with the listeners, and that could highlight this role of the municipalities, but also the cooperation of the different stakeholders?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first sort of key success stories is Kipi itself, because it wasn't an easy road to build something completely new up from the ground level and think about the service offering and think about the operational model and all of that. And now after like a little bit less than 2 years, I can say that we are a lot clearer in what we are actually offering and what's the change that we want to make happen in the operational environment and what kind of tools we offer for that and what kind of sparring and help and also sometimes a little push as well so that things happen. So I think we are sort of one of the case examples of these success stories where we've been able to build a new kind of orchestrator to make that systemic change happen. But then some of the sort of examples that we've been a part of implementing or doing, we never do something on our own because that doesn't make sense. It has to be in somebody else's agenda or somebody else's sort of scope for us to be able to sort of, for us to have any sense to do something. But one of the things that we have done now, we're always trying to find tools where the city or the municipality could sort of incentivize companies to do things according to circular economy. And one of the things that we have here in Finland is that the municipalities and the cities, they actually are quite big landowners. And this is very specific, I think, to Finland, which means that they have a lot of power over how that land is actually used, especially if we talk about house building. And one of the things, we didn't do this alone. We did this with a lot of different stakeholders, and Recreate project, which is a Horizon funded project, was one of the really key stakeholders in developing this. But we developed this kind of land allocation criteria that you can use when you allocate the land to companies to then build on, to make sure that the companies also have to take circular economy into consideration when they're doing the actual building phase. And it has quite a variety of different indicators and different criteria, and you can sort of pick the cherries on top of it and use what you want. There's, I think, about 20 different criteria under different kind of themes that you can use depending on where your land is and what you want to do with it. And I think that's one of the really good case examples where we created quite a tangible tool. And it took us a very long time to develop that, because you have to take so many things into consideration, from legislation to sort of different kind of things that municipalities have to do, or things that we need to take into consideration from the company's perspective. And we had a lot of sort of ways that different entities could join into the development project, so that we could make sure that the criteria is as usable as possible. And now it's actually in our pages. So anybody can download that from our pages and sort of start using that. And I've heard, for example, that the city of Mikkeli is now one of the first ones that are using that criteria now. So I think that's one really good case example. I can give you more if you want, but that's a good case example of this kind of role that we can take in developing those tools, having that market dialogue with the different actors to make sure that the tools that we develop are actually usable, because there's no point in us developing tools if nobody can use them. And then also sharing that information, and then also sparring and helping municipalities to use that tool. So that's sort of where our role comes into play.
Interesting, and I think that's a very critical factor in the transition towards circularity. As you said, I mean, land usage and all of that, but also the role that municipalities have in developing the urban space where circularity will take place. I mean, in many places, you mentioned going from city to region. I mean, I remember a discussion we had a couple of years ago when we talked about the fact that the cities are very often too small, just from a business activity point of view, to cater for circularity, and the country is too large for that. So the region actually provides a very good playing ground or platform to enable circularity. And then you can naturally use the role that the city, the municipality have, the region has in that context, in planning, in building the urban environment to cater for circularity, but also to build public-private partnerships or enable companies to play that role. So I think this is a very good example. And I like the idea that you're then sharing that in kind of an open source approach for other cities to replicate. I think that could actually help a lot in also making sure that other cities build on what you've been learning and what you've been developing.
Absolutely, and that's also how you create that operational environment, because we did quite a lot of, actually Recreate project did very extensive interviews with companies as well when we published that land allocation criteria for circular economy, and we sort of wanted to know what their intake on the criteria is and whether that's something that could actually create new markets for circular economy for them. And the answer was absolutely yes, from the biggest companies, building companies in Finland, and especially they said that if the bigger either municipalities or bigger cities or bigger regions would jointly start using that kind of criteria, that would be a very clear sort of indicator for them to actually start then offering those kind of services. And that's how you can actually create markets from a public entity point of view as well. So I think it's a very beautiful example of how the public sector can actually be there creating markets. And I think it was very interesting that the companies had such a positive outtake on that, and were actually very excited about the criteria and excited about the opportunities that it might actually create for them, especially if we're able to sort of share it with bigger cities or entire regions, which is exactly what we want to do, is sort of test these tools and create them perhaps with one or a few municipalities, but then share them for everybody to use, and also share the examples of how to use them and help and all of that.
And naturally, I mean, for companies, it gives a level of security if similar standards are being used, but also of replicability. What the same solution you use with one municipality or one region, you can use with others. So it actually becomes economically feasible to develop solutions and services for these new circular requirements that we need to work against in that context.
Absolutely. And that's why we also work with the European Commission and with the EU level, because then we've shared those, and we obviously always have to translate them into English as well, because then we're trying to share them with other European countries as well, to not just have the effect here, but also because most of these companies, they work in other countries as well. So then there's that level that we also need to consider. It's quite a lot of advocacy that we need to do, but it's quite necessary, because that's how we create that operating environment that pushes us all towards the systemic change, which needs to happen, but hasn't really happened yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the different stakeholders and the wider community. So how do you engage the wider community? How do you engage the different stakeholders and help them to talk the same language and basically start to understand each other? Because naturally, I mean, the business talks very differently from the municipalities, talks very differently from investors or other parts of society. So what's the role of Kipi as the orchestrator, as the translator maybe sometimes between these different players?
That's actually a very good question and very important question that we've had to sort of think about quite a lot. And when we started recruiting people for us, we have 3.5 people working for us at the moment. That was actually one of the things that I had in mind all the time, that I need people who can speak municipality, who can speak investor, and who can speak company. Because without that, nobody will be able to speak with us. And we can't be the mediator between these different entities if we don't speak the language of all of these. And that's why I said that I speak quite fluent engineer as well in the beginning, because I think it's quite important to have that sort of talent and have that. And we sort of especially work with municipalities, and we look at the sort of the business environment through the lenses of municipalities and what municipalities can do differently in their actions so that the market environment is created. But one of the things that we obviously have to do is listen to the companies with a very sort of attentive ear, so that we know what their needs are, what kind of maybe bottlenecks there are in the cooperation with municipalities at the moment, what kind of services, innovations, techniques they would have to offer that the municipalities could even procure, because public procurements are a huge amount of money used every year, which could be used also for circular economy and sustainability, but that doesn't happen at the moment. So we have quite a lot of one-to-one discussions with companies all the time, where we're trying to sort of figure out what their needs are. And one of the really good tools that we have to then put the municipalities and the public sector and the companies together is market dialogues. I think this is a very underused tool that we have that is actually related to public procurement, but it doesn't even have to be, that we can use to bring the public sector and the private companies together. And we hear this over and over again from companies, that they would like to have a lot more conversation and a lot more co-creation and a lot more interaction with municipalities. And I think from the municipalities' point of view, especially if you look at the law of public procurement, it's very difficult for them to have conversations with specific companies, because it might be considered not very okay, because you can't really sort of prefer one company over others. But market dialogues are a beautiful, beautiful sort of tool to facilitate this kind of conversation and share those experiences and share those techniques and tools and innovations that the companies have, and also make sure that companies understand the coming point of view of municipalities and what the operational environment looks like from that perspective. So we use market dialogues a lot. We've had 5, I think, only this year in different themes, where we brought companies and municipalities and procurement units together to sort of discuss and see what we need to take into account if we want to share more and co-create more. So that's one of the ways that we can sort of facilitate that cooperation, which hasn't happened before. And we see a true need for somebody, an orchestrator, to come and start doing that, asking the right questions from companies, but then also trying to explain the point of view of municipalities to companies.
Yeah, and I think it's actually a little bit driven by the very bad image lobbying has become, like, where companies are actually pushing their own interest without any regard of society or of sustainability or anything. And I think that is what's driving this distancing from a conversation between public organizations and private organizations. At the same time, I think you mentioned the word advocacy. I think we need to talk more about advocacy in a positive way, in a way where we're basically talking, where we're having a dialogue, and where we have an exchange of ideas on positive things that are not only positive for an individual or for a company, for a single company, but that are positive for the wider society. And I feel that companies are more and more interested to have these conversations, also with municipalities, with cities, with regulators, with basically all the different parts of society, to actually further sustainable development in that context. But it's I think it's something that's developing slowly, and where we need to overcome some of our old thinking patterns.
Yeah, and I think you need to understand that advocacy isn't the same as lobbying, because when you advocate, you make clear your standpoints and you make clear your aims and your targets, and it's all transparent. Whereas in lobbying, you're not transparent. And this is a very old-fashioned way of understanding lobbying as well. But I think we talk about advocacy a lot when it comes to Kipi. And I was lucky to work with one of the best advocacy experts in Finland when I was working for NGOs. I was shout out to all of my colleagues there. I was really lucky to sort of understand the value of advocacy and also the value of trust in developing difficult things. And I think when you asked about the stakeholder engagement and how we do it, we've noticed that because we want to do very tangible things, we don't want to just stay on the strategic level and on that level of development, which is important, but it doesn't really change anything concrete. And we decided when we started operating that we want to operate on the tangible level. So in those units in the cities where the actual experts make the procurements or do the project or whatever. And in order for us to be able to do that, we need to get the trust of those people, and we need to show them that we are not causing too much damage to their work, and that the things that we do are added value and something that actually brings something added to their tables. And it means that we need to have very good operating relationships with those people and a lot of trust. And I'm always saying that any development you can, and I know that this might sound a little bit difficult and annoying for some people, but there's always a person behind anything that either goes forward or doesn't go forward. There's always a person behind who is either willing to make that thing happen or for some reason doesn't want it to go ahead. Obviously, any kind of sort of organizational barriers can hinder or help you in that development, but it always comes down to people. And we need to realize that when we're cooperating as well with different stakeholders, that we're actually cooperating with people who need trust in order to be able to sort of, and I understand it really well, in order to be able to work with us. So we've had to use quite a lot of time in building that trust, especially with those experts in those city units that we need if we want to make that tangible change happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think trust is one of the key ingredients here, specifically as we're talking about systemic change. We're not talking about incremental small things, but we're talking about really fundamental things that will impact businesses on a whole new level from what we've seen so far. It's not a tweak in the supply chain, but it's or the business model, but it's completely rethinking how you approach your business, basically from A to Z in that context. So you need trust in your partners to embrace that journey.
Absolutely. And we're also affecting the workload of specific people, because when we're saying you need to do things differently, it also means that you need to do more. Usually it doesn't mean that you stop doing the old things, but it means in the beginning that you actually add something completely new on top of the things that you are already doing. And that's why it's so important for us to also then come up with tools and come up with help, not just adding on the burden of already burdened municipality workers or company people, that we need to also then offer some help as well. And that was very important to us from the beginning, that it has to be tangible, it has to be concrete, and it has to be helpful. And if it's not, then we need to be honest with ourselves that we are not servicing the systemic change that we say we need to service. And then we need to sort of quit existing, and somebody else needs to come and do the job better than we did. So I'm always trying to also be very honest with my stakeholders and with myself, that the minute my focus changes from the operational environment to our own existence and our own organization, and I become more preoccupied about what happens to my workers, to my employees, and to my organization than I do about the change that we might make in the operational environment, then it's time for us to quit. It's time for us to sort of unravel this organization and do something else. So I want to be very honest that we need to always have the focus on how do we change the operational environment towards that very difficult systemic change.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to fall into this trap of self-sufficiency and self-centricity, and not focus really on your mission and vision and the change that you aim to drive. I agree.
Absolutely.
Now, looking ahead a little bit, I mean, what are some of the trends or developments you're excited about that are upcoming, that you're working on, or that you foresee in the developments towards circular economy in the Pirkanmaa region, but also beyond that in the cooperation with the municipalities? Are there some trends or some future activities you're excited about?
Yes, this is a very difficult question for me, because sometimes I notice that I sort of slunk into this despair when looking at these very difficult questions, but then sometimes I'm so uplifted because I see this trend of something changing, something shifting in a very systemic way. We're not there yet, but I think we're on the brink. We need a couple of pushes from legislation and a couple of pushes from funding and a couple of pushes from orchestrators that focus on specific things to make that change happen. But we see so many indicators. We see new companies. We see old companies changing the way that they operate and changing the way that they do business so that it's more resource efficient, or even creating more value out of their resource than they did before. And from the municipal sector, I see so much concrete things happening, not just strategy, because strategy has been there for a while, especially for sustainability, but we've been lacking the implementation. But now I see very sort of admirable implementation plans happening in the bigger and also in the smaller cities, both here in Pirkanmaa region, but also, like, for example, in the Helsinki-Uusimaa region. So I see this kind of change on the brink of happening. And I think we just need to nudge a little bit, but it's going to be huge when that happens. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I see. And I see municipalities thinking about added value, like how can we make actual change with the aims that we have for circular economy or for sustainability. And for example, the National Green Deal process that has been going on for circular economy on the national level, together with the ministries, even though it is voluntary and even though at the end the funding and the tools maybe weren't as big as we hoped, but when I've been looking at the different commitments that different entities have been doing in their own green deals, they are actually quite ambitious. So yeah, I'm hopeful in a way that sometimes isn't very normal for us who are in the deep ends of sustainability, because we do get depressed every once in a while, but I'm actually quite hopeful at the moment that the change in the mindset and the change in the value of different resources is about to happen.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and I think that's we always talk about tipping points in a
Hmm.
negative way when we talk about climate change, but I think that's actually a very positive tipping point
Yes.
or inflection point that we're seeing, that we're approaching, that a broader and broader alliance of different organizations, people, be it in private or in the public space, are really joining the bandwagon in that sense, and are really putting effort forward that goes beyond the pure compliance topics, and are broadening their scope. So from that point of view, I agree with you. I think we're approaching this inflection point of where it becomes mainstream to do things sustainably, and it's not just a novelty or a compliance topic that's sitting in the reporting or in the marketing department. So I fully agree with you.
Absolutely. And also I see it in the funding mechanisms, and I see it in the sort of in the funding realm as well, because let's be honest, when the money goes, that's where things start happening. And now with taxonomy and with sort of funding operators understanding a little bit better about green transition and circular economy within that transition, I think and I'm really looking forward to what happens with taxonomy and with those kind of requirements in the upcoming years, because that's going to completely change also the way that we fund things, which is quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. The coffee is unfortunately empty, and it's time to wrap up this episode of the Circular Coffee Break. Thanks a lot, Karoliina, for joining me today. I think we covered a lot of ground, but there's still a lot of topics we could have still discussed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael. This was really, really a joy. I always enjoy talking with you. So thank you.
Thank you. For all of you listening out there, as always, we hope you found today's episode interesting, inspiring. It gave you some new ideas, maybe to implement in your city or your region, or talk with the representatives of your city or your region to pick up some of the ideas Karoliina shared with us today. If you like the podcast, we're looking to build a circular community around the circular coffee break to share ideas and insights and inspire the change that we all need. So please go ahead, share the podcast with your friend, with your family, with your network, to get as many people on the bandwagon, as we said, as possible, to learn about circular economy, to learn about sustainability, and all of the great solutions and ideas that are out there in the business world, in the world of public organizations, as well as in the world of NGOs. The only thing left for me is to thank you for joining us today, for listening in, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you here on the Circular Coffee Break podcast.